So, hello everyone. I am here today with the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Sheena Piehota. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Yeah,
Fantastic.
Piehota. You're close enough.
Piehota. I'll begin by reading Dr. Sheena's bio. Dr. Sheena Piehota is an accomplished scholar and PhD level board certified practitioner in the field of applied behavior analysis, with a strong commitment to both clinical excellence and compassionate care. She has made a lasting impact in her field. Sheena is also a devoted military spouse, supporting her husband through his service, and a proud mother to two daughters. Outside of her professional life, she enjoys water sports and cherishes quality time with her family, always striving to balance her passion for helping others with the joys of motherhood and family life. Amen to that. And just to confirm, Sheena, we are speaking with you. You are currently where in the world exactly?
I'm in Tampa, Florida.
You're in Tampa, Florida, and I am speaking to you from Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Early morning for me, late evening for you.
Ooh.
So welcome, Sheena, and thank you very much for giving us your time to share with us a little bit about your background and your perspectives. I guess another important question to begin with is, what is your role within the QABA?
Yeah, so I am the longest standing board member. I also am currently servicing as the vice president of the board.
Okay, and longest standing meaning when did that begin?
I got to go back a whole nother lifetime ago. I think I joined the board in 2015, I believe.
Wow. Okay, so you've seen quite a bit, and I know that a big part of the work that you have done has been in the area of sort of getting licenses for the sort of QABA practitioners in different states around the United States. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I have worked with our legal team, with the legislative teams, and advocating, working, speaking with senators, representatives, really giving them the knowledge to understand what QBA was, how it expanded access to care in the different states. North Carolina was one of the first states that we actually got it going in. That was a 10-year mission. So I saw it when we first started, prior to them even having licensure. When licensure got into play, unfortunately, at that time, there was an attempt to exclude QABA. We really worked hard with our lobbyists out there, and we were able to see that come through. So that was a really big win after 10 years of working with practitioners who could work in the state, but when licensure came in, they risked them not being able to service kids.
So help us to understand. I mean, I am somebody who I've come across the U.S. industry through our work in other areas of the world, mostly through people who are living, working as expatriates in countries like Vietnam. And they have U.S. based insurance. So I've got a little bit of understanding of the U.S. system, and we hear about it a lot. I mean, the newsletters tell us about new states in which licensure has happened, but I think many of us in the QABA community perhaps don't really understand what's involved, what exactly all this means. Can you maybe walk us through what you mean by licensure and what the process is? You mentioned things like lobbyists and senators. Walk us through what all this looks like.
Yeah, so each state can either choose to create licensure like they would for any other practice. But if you don't, you go by the certification. So originally, if you were a QBA, a BCBA, you could go into any state and any insurance that accepted that credential and work. You just need to get credentialed. When you layer on licensure, really what licensure should be doing is it should be ensuring that the practitioners that work in that state understand the rules and regulations of that state. If there are any specific laws, if there's anything specific to the insurance funders that you need to know. Unfortunately, it has not gotten to that level yet. So really, in any state, if you go apply for licensure, I submit my BCBA certification or my QBA certification. I then pay a fee. I give them a background check. Usually it comes with a letter of recommendation. I get my fingerprints and I'm handed a license. What that means is it's another layer. It should be another layer for protection. One of the benefits to the state is that in the event that you do something within that state that is illegal, or fraud or anything like that, you can lose your license. And when you lose your license, you have to report that to the board. So it can create another layer of protection for practitioners. From a working in the state standpoint, I think one of the barriers is it's another step in the process, because if I came into, let's say, Texas and I wasn't licensed, I would now have to get licensed. It could take anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months. I would then have to get that. I could not get credentialed with the insurance payers until I was licensed.
So there's a link between your licensing and your ability to be reimbursed by insurance in the United States.
Yeah, and each state has their own rules and regulations. So that's where it gets really interesting. So a state like Arizona, they actually have an additional layer of requirements for hours that superseded at one point what we used to have to acquire in just fieldwork supervision for the certification. So that was a problem for persons like myself who had finished their fieldwork many, many moons ago, and I had just happened to want to work in that state. So I had to create an exemption. I had to try and reach out to one of my prior supervisors and see if they could sign off saying, yes, I did have the extra hours. Things like a letter of recommendation. I personally feel like if we're going to request that, we should be reading it. Does it really matter? I really would like to make sure that things that are going there are not just logistical red tape, that they actually are impacting the practitioners in a meaningful way. I think the intent of licensure is really good for protecting the field. I just think in some states we tend to get a little bit more red tape than it's necessary. Like it took me almost 3 months to get licensed in Arizona.
Okay.
And in Utah, I got like 24 hours.
And if you're licensed in one state, say you're living in North Carolina, and you go across state lines to work with a client somewhere else, do you have to be licensed in that state as well, or?
Yeah, so you have to be licensed in the state that your client is in. So you can work remotely in some states. So if I want to service a kid in Utah, I have to be licensed in Utah. If I want to service a kid in Utah and North Carolina, if they both have licensure, I have to have licensure in both of those states. Some of them do allow, like as a military spouse, sometimes I can say, hey, my husband's getting stationed here. I won't have to necessarily meet all of the requirements if I have held another license in another state, which is common within some of the, some of the other fields. But it does become another financial part, right? Because every license you have to pay for. You have to pay for renewals. You have to also meet if they have any individual CE requirements. So like this year alone, I think when I will get recertification for my BCBA, my QBA, and 4 of my licenses, it was about $1,500.
Wow, that's and quite a lot of time as well, I would imagine. And
just going through the applications is a pain.
I think very often that's the bigger part of the cost of these things. It's not so much the money, it's the time that you've got to put into. And I don't mean doing the CEUs. I mean just figuring out what you've got to do, reading the websites and going.
Oh yeah, that's a whole nother one. Is like getting your CEU and then uploading them to every single portal over and over and over.
Making sure you haven't screwed it up and got one thing, there's uploaded the wrong thing to the wrong site. I've done that one before when you're going across multiple platforms. It's always quite a juggling act. And then you mentioned words like lobbying and people blocking the QABA. What are you talking about there?
So in some states, when they created the licensure, there was specific language that was used. And I think people don't really understand or think that if you include one board over another, how, some people are in the interpretation like, oh, if it says this, it's a general. It's not. So when law specifically stated the BACB and did not state the QABA, then they actually would not allow for QBAs to be licensed there. So we went through that for a little bit in North Carolina, where there was a potential that they weren't going to allow QBAs to work and they weren't going to allow QSPSs to work. So really a lot of it was just meeting with the representatives and explaining to them so they understood it. I don't think it was with malice intent that they were not informed about it. I think sometimes people don't know. QABA also, while it's been around for some time, it's still unknown, very, very unknown, just kind of like ABA in general, right? I live in this field. I live and breathe it. I use it on my husband, use it on my kids, even though it doesn't always work on them. But I'd forget that it's not something that everybody knows about. So I think it was the same way with the QABA. It was unknown, so it wasn't included. So that's where we really come in to work to advocate for the practitioners, the quality practitioners, to be able to increase access to care and give them a choice.
And, where is the QABA now in terms of licensure? How many states and what's the sort of general sort of status of all of this now?
Yeah, so I think it depends. Right now, I know we have North Carolina, we have Texas, and then we're working on reciprocity in Arizona, Ohio, and Missouri. We also are working on Washington, and then we do have some QABAs that we're able to seek licensure in Virginia.
Okay, right. So, and the goal is obviously to go right the way across the United States.
That would be the goal. And again, it's really just about extending access to care and giving people a choice in which, what board they want to be certified in. in certain states that don't have licensure, there is, if they have TRICARE, we're actually written into the TOM, which is the standard operating manual for TRICARE. So we are written into that for our QASPSs. So that is the mid-tier level. And so in any state that has TRICARE, they can work as a mid-tier if there is no licensure and or they're not included in licensure.
Okay. So thank you. I mean, it's interesting just to sort of understand it. Like I say, we hear about these things a lot. It's spoken about a lot, but many of us in other regions of the world aren't familiar with all of this. It's very much a North American thing, and in countries like Vietnam, it's a very different landscape which we're operating in. And
it's even confusing here. So I mean, honestly, you also have like certain insurances, right? Certain insurances may not recognize a mid-tier for a certain code. And so if they have not yet, or they haven't caught up, you can't bill that. So it's just really, I mean, it's navigating, right, your certification, the licensure, then what the insurance says, and then figuring out, okay, what can and can't I do? And I think it's something, I constantly try and stay abreast of the fact of what is going on, being in compliance. So I think it is a little bit complex, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes a little bit easier.
Yeah, a whole different game to play. I'm interested, Sheena, in perhaps, this is obviously a big area of your work, and ABA is obviously a big area of your work. I mean, I'd like to explore exactly, first of all, what are you doing within the field of ABA itself, and then maybe we could branch out and talk a little bit about some of the other things that you do, because I know that ABA is not the only hat that you wear, professionally speaking. So can we start, what exactly, tell us about the work that you are doing in the ABA field at the moment, and I don't mind if you want to give a little bit of a history to that as well. I know that you have a company. Let's hear a little bit around that.
Yeah, so currently I'm working as a vice president. I oversee clinical and operations. Originally it was across 18 states. I work looking at the clinical compliance, looking at operations on day to day. I started with the company. They were really small. We, really did.
You're allowed to name drop here. What?
Yeah, so it's a little bit confusing. It falls under something called title. And really, long story short, I was hired for one company. We merged with another one, and then we created a third one. Okay. And so I inherited all of them. There's a much longer story to it. Probably not as fun as it was for me to live, but I work currently under title, and within that, I oversee all of that within the departments. Recently, I was able to bring on a great colleague of mine who helps oversee the clinical part now mainly, and I help support in the operational focus.
Okay, so you said you're functioning in 18 states. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, so you're functioning in 18 states. How many staff do you have?
That's a wonderful question. I actually don't know that answer because I'm pretty sure I lost count. At one time I used to know and I pride myself on knowing most of the BCBA's names, but I used to know a lot of technicians, and it's a good and bad thing, right? Like, I love the fact that we have been able to grow to the point where we've increased access to all of these kids' lives, and I've been able to hear the wins, right? I love that. I love to hear the wins of our practitioners, because they're not my wins. They're the company's wins. They're the wins of the children that we service. And so I love that. But there's also the part that is a little bit sad that I, don't necessarily get a hands-on to every single practitioner that we're able to service, but I am proud of the work that we've done.
And so this is obviously very much ABA work that you're doing in all of these 18 states. Yep. What sort of what systems have you got to I mean, an operation of that size? How do you ensure that it follows your own sort of quality and brand and approach to the field?
Yeah, they're great systems. I started in this field. We had pencil and paper data. That's really hard to manage quality when you have that, right? So we utilize a lot of AI. Currently, we use one thing that I think is really great, especially for clinical quality. We use a tool called Brillium. And Brillium, and I'm probably not going to say this as they would. I think the word bots I hear often. I'm not a techie. But pretty much it will audit like 1,000 notes in 10 minutes. And so we set the left and right parameters for what it looks for. But what that helps us do is that helps us audit them and then go back and work with those teams on their medical notes, making sure that our practitioners know what they should and shouldn't be billing, making sure that when they are working in ABA, they are delivering a therapeutic service. Often, you hear in some companies babysitting. We don't do babysitting. We're here to change the life of the people that we service. And if we're not doing that, then we don't need to be there. So it's really about making sure that the quality of note, and the quality of work matches the quality that we expect. So that's one way we do it. Our data collection system, we use HighRasmuth, which is actually a newer platform out there. I can't say enough amazing things about it. It is phenomenal. I used Central Reach for quite some time. And, it was a great platform, but it was a little bit complex. So we really wanted something our clinicians could work off of that helps to, create really good programming and quality and make sure that it's user friendly. And then from an operational side, we actually use a platform, Lumery, on the Salesforce component of it, which we do our scheduling, we do our client intakes, pretty much a whole life cycle of client employees. But utilizing those tools, we can really look at the metrics and the numbers, right? We can really look at even the outcomes within HighRasmuth. We can look at a value-based care model of what are the outcomes that we're delivering, right? What is the life cycle of a client, and are we actually making progress? And if not, are we really are we doing a visual analysis of the data to make sure that the outcomes match what we anticipate they're going to match?
And then what about your sort of, this is great and super interesting. I've got a much smaller organization than yours, but scale is always a question hanging over us. Like what do you actually do in terms of hands? Are you out visiting clients as well? Are you doing consultations, etc., or is it mostly sort of back office work?
So I right now pretty much I feel like if it's a problem that comes to my desk, unfortunately I hear more about the things that need to be fixed versus being able to get the face-to-face. But on occasion I get to attend the conferences and meet our clinicians. I also you will definitely find me in a center in my heels jumping on a trampoline with one of our kids if I need to. I think it's always important for our employees to see I don't sit anywhere. I sit at the same level as everybody. And one of my biggest things is I don't care if you're the janitor or the CEO. I don't care if you have a high school diploma or a PhD. Everybody gets treated equally. Everybody has the same respect. Without the people that clean our facilities, my BCBAs couldn't do their job. Without the RBTs, I couldn't do my job. So I think it's really important on occasion to be able to go out there and really, just say face to them and let them know like, hey, we appreciate the work you do. That's so undermined in our field. We forget the basic principles of ABA, reinforce the behavior.
Yeah, and I mean, we also forget the fact that the burnout typically happens at the RBT ABAT level, doesn't it? I mean, that's most of those guys. I don't know the actual statistics, but trying to support people at that level is the biggest challenge of the lot, because you're brand new to the field. You're faced with endless challenges on a day-to-day basis. You don't necessarily have the skills or the experience to would deal with it, or just know that it's part of the job, and all of those things. And so it you really do need to be there for those guys and lift them up and make sure that they can get through their day.
No, absolutely. Their voice doesn't get heard enough, and I think that's something I try and do when I'm there is just take a minute, listen to their stories too, because they're the real winners, right? They're the ones who we write the programs, and that's amazing, but they're the ones who are there day to day, really making a change. And I think sometimes we undervalue and underestimate the power that is. I mean, I was a technician at one point, so I get it. It's a hard job. I remember coming home, getting kicked, spit on, and I was tired by the end of the day. Yeah,
no, it's tough work. I really like I think it's sort of the opening chapters. There's the Bailey ethics book where for RBTs, and it goes in, I think, in the earliest chapters, and speaks through, this is your supervisor's ethical responsibility to you, and it's absolutely fantastic. And I teach a course at university for technicians, and I really enjoy that class, and I pull that book out and say, hey, here you go. This is you have a right to be supervised. It's an ethical obligation on the side of your supervisors to be there for you, and to make sure that you're getting the support that you need. Can we, out of interest, I'd like to talk a little bit more about ethics. But before we do that, you don't just do ABA. What are the other things that you're doing?
Yeah, so I do consult work. I consult with different organizations. I consult with supervisees. I also dabble in trauma-informed care. Kind of the roots of who I am. my master's was in psychology with a focus in ABA. And then I obtained my PhD in IO psychology. So one of the passions that I really liked is being able to integrate ABA not only to working in the field of of autism or other diagnosis, but really applying that to businesses, larger organizations. And then when I decided at one point in my career to take a break from ABA, I was actually the director of a facility for women who were either pregnant or just had a child and recovering from substance abuse, as well as I oversaw a schizophrenic unit. And it was really interesting to step outside the field as we know it of ABA, and really kind of dabble into how we change behaviors and how that connects with the brain and rebuilding, kind of synapses and how we respond to things, because people who have substance abuse, are very impulsive. So just changing that behavior really can also help just change what they're doing and how the success rate of them leaving a treatment facility and not just saying, okay, we've got you off the drugs, right? But it's that next step. It's changing that behavior, changing the impulsivity, changing the idea of what addiction is and how I can recognize it, and using antecedent management to do that.
That's great. So, we're talking here about, the ABA being used not just for the treatment of autism. And I know that now, correct in understanding now that it's a requirement for trauma-informed care to be a part of your CEUs. Is that correct?
For QABA, it is, yeah.
For the QABA now, we're looking at trauma-informed care. This is your background. Was this your influence primarily on?
It was something that I had actually brought up to the board after speaking with some people at the Capitol in Florida. Because one of the real things that we did see is a couple things, right? The field, a trauma now, COVID was a trauma for people, right? We don't realize, how our history and our environment can create traumatic events. And it's really important as practitioners that we are aware of this so we don't recreate it. The number one thing in trauma-informed care is being safe, right? Making sure the client feels safe. And that should be a priority regardless. But I think, it was something when I was speaking with them, we recognized, especially in the state of Florida, that there was a lot of problems with people not being informed on how to approach trauma-informed care. So when we had that conversation, I did bring it to the board. And, I thought that it was something that was important that we continue to obtain CEUs on. And then the other one was looking at it and addressing how we deal with different multiple diagnoses. A lot of kids nowadays are coming. They're not just coming with autism. They're coming with a diagnosis of autism and other comorbidities. So, you have to really understand what is a therapy targeting in that moment? Are you targeting, the core deficits within autism, or is there also this other arching layer? And does that need to be taken care of medically before we can, work on this? Do I need to know about that, right? If a child has multiple personalities, that I'm going to treat them, or how I treat them from a therapeutic standpoint is going to be very different than how I, might just treat a client that has just an ASD diagnosis. If they have ASD and Down syndrome, right? I need to be aware of, how those play into what they can do, what the processing level is. If a child has a TBI, if they can't make short-term memories, how do I teach them skills, right? If I don't know these things, then I might do it, the same way that I've, been taught from the basics, and I'm not going to get the progress that I need. So if I really dig into it and I understand how to look at the approach, I can really shape that and get a lot more success.
On the topic of trauma, I think this is an interesting one and one where I think certainly I did and most people did trip over this problem early on in our careers, and the awareness of trauma is relatively recent. It's sort of I began in the field a little over 20 years ago, and people just didn't talk about it. It was not something that people were aware of, and I look back at some of the clients that I had back then, and the approaches I take, I'm horrified at. What would you say?
PIP, and I'm like, oh, that was a little rough, wasn't it?
Yeah. What would, as somebody who's got experience in both areas, what would you say is the primary shift in approach that's typically required when you are working with a child diagnosed with ADHD and has a trauma history versus a child that doesn't? What's the major difference for a practitioner?
Yeah, I think the first thing is asking the question. What often I see, especially within practitioners, they don't really ask in-depth questions to these families. They go through this list that they've been wrote to go over, but asking does your child have any traumas? And then identifying what that trauma is. So that way we make sure we don't recreate it. I think that's the number one step in approach, is knowing what the trauma is so you don't recreate it. I think you're looking at two things there, right? When you're looking at the trauma, you have to approach it, and it's prioritizing building trust over compliance, right? You're never going to be able to work with a person that has trauma if they don't trust you. So we really need to build that rapport and make sure we focus on that before we ever even start with any of the dimensions. Being aware of, what the trauma is and how the language that we use, the tone that we use. I am a very loud human. It's just in my nature. I'm Hispanic. If my husband says, if you're not the loudest, you're not going to be heard. It was an adjustment to him. It was probably a trauma the first Thanksgiving he ever spent with me. So I think being aware of that, I have to recognize as a practitioner that being loud, like if somebody's trauma might have been associated with yelling and abuse, that I need to be a little bit more calm and reserved. I need to not have such large, mannerisms. I need to make sure that I create a safe space for them to function in. I think the other thing would be making sure to avoid those triggers. It has to be the root of every step that you take. Every time you make a move, you have to think back to what are their traumas, and am I creating something that might be a trigger for them? Am I recreating the event? So I think those are the most important things. And then even, looking at the ADHD. I have ADHD. My husband had it. My daughter today just actually got diagnosed with it. I was like, big shocker there. But even dealing with that, right? I know that when she's wiggling, sometimes she'll be doing like this and I just go, please stop, please stop. But I also have to give her an outlet to that, right? So if I know that that is part of who she is and that is part of her ADHD diagnosis, how do I support her? Building in those supports based off of that. And that's going to be treated differently than I'm going to treat a child who maybe just has a singular diagnosis of autism.
Yeah. And I think one of the other aspects of trauma, particularly, ADHD is another interesting conversation, but going back to trauma, I think one of the areas that we really need to some better training on is also the reactive behavioral strategies. We avoid the triggers, but obviously we're never perfect at doing that. And I think when you're dealing with a child with a trauma history and their behavior escalates, it's a very different beast that you're dealing with compared to a child that's trying to manipulate you to get a cookie. We can sometimes trigger a reaction which certainly we make assumptions about functions that are being served, and we may respond to that in a certain way. Whereas I think in the case of trauma, things like de-escalation, help understanding the importance of safety, understanding that this is potentially very damaging as an experience.
Yeah, I always say, we in ABA, we use a hands-on approach, right? Sometimes if a child's engaging in SIB or they might attempt to hurt themselves, we're going to do least to most restrictive, but we do response blocking, some of those, and it's something I'm always aware of. With trauma informed care, we don't ask the question of what's wrong with you, right? We ask what happened. That's super important to know what happened to them. And you go into depth in that. What was the environment like? Even things such as room colors. I was on the phone with a parent who was in the middle of a crisis a couple weeks ago, and it was a state, I don't have service. They just got into my line, and she had this child that had been put in her house and through an emergency foster system. And she was like, the kid doesn't want to go near the bathroom. I said, okay, great. They don't have to. They don't have to go anywhere near the bathroom. They got to go to the bathroom. Let's go get a toilet, go get a portable potty, put it in their room. Go, if they want to wash their hands, go to the sink in the kitchen, right? You don't have to follow the standard norms, especially if you don't know the full trauma, or if it's just the first time, right? Again, make her feel safe. Make this person feel safe in the environment that they're in, because then you can also find out the why. I think the other part too is if somebody had any form of trauma that was restrictive, whether that was by hands or by, a harness or something like that, we've got to be very careful, not even hand guiding, right? You don't even want to just reach for their hand and guide them, because that might be a trigger. If you're trying to de-escalate them, maybe they've escalated to the point where, they're in a full-on meltdown mode. There's something I thought about the other day. I've got a 6-year-old, and, she'll start to have a meltdown. She's yelling and screaming, and I'm like yelling and screaming. I'm like, what is going on? Like, why are you not, just calm down? Then I realize I'm like, okay, back to the basics. She doesn't, and at that point she's 6, her executive processor is not fully functioning. She's not comprehending anything I'm saying. So I thought about it the other day. I just grabbed her, I was like, I'm going to hold you. Let me know when you're calm down. We're going to know some breathing techniques. And she didn't do the breathing techniques, because in that moment she's not learning anything. But I just held her and I waited for calm. And then afterwards we talked about it, right? I was, okay, what upset you? She's like, I don't know. I said, okay, that's a fair response. But I think even in that, within the practice area, I find practitioners, when a child is in a chaotic meltdown state, they tend to want to then implement their replacement behaviors. That is not the time. We need to teach our replacement behaviors in a calm environment and reinforce them. When they're in a meltdown mode, sometimes it's okay to say, hey, let's take a break, right? And there's even that part of that assent of just it's fine. Let's have this meltdown. We're done with it. Then we can, we can address it.
And you hit upon, I think, what a real the magic word there of assent, which is the sort of new movement in the field, which entered about 10 years ago and is growing in force. And I think it's great that we're having this conversation. I think it's great that we've got people now speaking in these terms about the management of challenging behavior, and we've moved a long way beyond where things began, which was very much a sort of consequence-focused approach, and there's a lot of merit in that. We're not dismissing any of these things, but there's more to it, and managing these outbursts in a variety of ways, being willing to say, what, this is not a battle we need to fight right now. It's like we don't have to fix everything today. Because if we try, well, we can create trauma. We can certainly damage a relationship. It is toxic to be walking in there and saying, right, I am going to place every single behavioral difficulty on extinction immediately. And it's a real misapplication, I think, a misunderstanding of our role as practitioners. We're not little scientific bots. We're human beings, and we're dealing with human beings. And then, getting into this topic of assent, it's really shaped, I think, in the right direction. The way in which we view learners' behavior. Maybe you can sort of elaborate on that from the point of view of somebody. You've been very involved in the ethics committee at one time as well in the QABA. Is that correct? Perhaps you could sort of just articulate a little bit more around the importance of assent and what that is in contemporary ABA.
Yeah, so I think one thing, that's important with assent is that it helps build that trust, right, and that rapport, because it's kind of like, you're allowing the child to lead to a certain extent. Obviously, we don't compromise safety for it. We make sure that the child is in a safe environment. When we look at it, if you look at the ethics code 1.0, it really talks about honoring the client, the dignity, and so seeking assent whenever possible. So, the difference, people often, I think, get consent and assent mixed up. Consent is given by the decision maker. Assent is given by the client, who has a limited capacity of maybe words, actions, and behaviors, but they show willingness. When we look at assent, we're looking for cues, right? We're looking for smiling, nodding. Are they enjoying this? Is this adversive to them? Something you brought up was when I was trained in ABA, assent wasn't a thing, right? Like, yeah. Even how I grew up, it was like, this is the word, this is the law, this is what you do. And I think we function like that in the field for quite some time, where it's like, this is what the behavior plan says. You're having this behavior. We have to follow through on the demand. But sometimes that's not it, right? Like sometimes it's okay to say, this is obviously aversive. Let's come back to this. Let's not make the behavior worse. And, unfortunately, in my early career, I saw that so much where we didn't realize we were creating the behaviors, right? We were not creating an environment that, flourished the idea of let's antecedent management. Let's not have the behavior occur. Let's focus more on creating an environment where the behavior doesn't occur. And I think when we talk about assent, it's really checking with the client and what is their willingness to participate, and respecting it if they don't. And that doesn't mean like, okay, hey, they didn't want to sit at the table and do the work. If it's table time, we can work to transition, but maybe we don't, maybe it's a successful transition and then we go right to something else, right? It's building up that stamina to be able to do it. I think the other thing too is, really looking at what is their buy-in. These are humans, right? It doesn't matter if you have autism, if you have ADHD, you are a human. That is the root of who we are. And what we service is human. So we have to consider the fact that we are biological by nature, right? As a practicing psych, it's always important to evaluate the mentalistic components. If somebody is tired, maybe they don't want to engage in the programming that day because they're tired. That's okay. It is okay to say they're tired. We're going to take a step back. We're not pairing, right? I'm going to get their assent. I recognize the cues that they're giving me, and they're not prepared for this today. So I think those are a big part of it. And it's just, I always say this, and I say it often, is going back to the basics. I think we fail so much to start at the basics with every client and build our way up. Everybody is so quick to want to throw 75 programs on a behavior plan just to get justification for it, when you could justify if a client has behaviors. We're going to target the behaviors first because we're probably not learning anything for having those behaviors. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. It's, it's a real challenge in a way, certainly with newcomers to the field, to try and articulate or identify where the sort of line between recognizing and honoring assent and also at the same time needing to have standards that are maintained. I mean, it's sometimes misunderstood, and I must admit that in the beginning, I took it this way: was, well, this just sounds like you're letting a child do what they want, and if they all they have to do is moan a bit about the hard work that you're getting them to do, and that's it. All bets are off. They don't have to do it, and it's not that, is it? I mean, it's not about abandoning standards. It's about reading behavior and making informed decisions, and being prepared that you might be wrong as the practitioner to follow through on protocol when it's going to damage the bigger picture, I guess, is the best way that I could articulate it. And knowing that we don't have to win every single battle. I mean, I think there was a false belief that I remember holding myself. Well, if you give in and reinforce this behavior, that's it. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse until it's completely manageable, and it'll be completely.
I think we must have all learned that. Like at some point, I feel like in our curriculum, we all learned that, because same thing. I felt the same way. I was like, no, you give in once, they're going to take a mile, and it was that mindset. And same thing. The first time I heard about Ascent, I was like, no, this goes against everything that I can think of. And I was, because it's a renewal year, I started taking more CUs, and I came across some really good ones on Behavior Live that talked about Ascent, and it shifted my thought process. Because I was like, I took one on Central Reach, and I was like, no, I mean, I was like, whatever Ascent this is, I want nothing to do with it. But then I went on there, and there was a couple. I wish I had them in front of me. One of them was just stellar. It was I think maybe it was like New World or Third Wave ABA or something. It really, like what it talked about, I was like, it really like dumbed it down for me to understand and see what it is, right? Like to your point, like looking at the fact that like I'm a behaviorist. I'm here to look at behavior, not just what I think is right. I have to look at how the client's responding to it and what if the treatment is effective.
Yeah. This segues us nicely into the topic of ethics, because obviously Ascent is front and center of much of what's happening in the ethics field, and this is something that you've been very engaged with. And I think something that we you and I and those of us who are educated in the Western world, the Western pedagogy, sometimes overlook is the fact that ethics are not things that are necessarily universal. I mean, I've been living and working in Vietnam for 20 years now, and it wasn't until relatively recently I had an experience. I was training some of our technicians a few years ago, and we were going through preparing them for their exam, and talking about ethics and going through ethical codes, and they really struggled with this. And sort of a few sessions in, one of them just turned to me and said, "What are ethics?" It really sort of knocked me over. I was like, "Oh God, really? You're asking me this?" And it's not that I'm not suggesting for a second that people in Vietnam or any other country are unethical. They are very, very much. But it's just that this is not a word. This is not an idea that's familiar, I think, in many cultures around the world. There are other ideas that do exist. So perhaps could I ask you to define what exactly do we mean by ethics for somebody who's not necessarily familiar with this, because it is quite confusing.
Yeah, no, and it is, right? Like, when I step outside of my little bubble and I think about that, I'm like, oh, like what are ethics? It's like Bailey and Birch book over there. It's it's this rule of 1.1, this and going down. But I think, when we talk about the root of ethics, it's a decision. It helps us a decision tree, right? That's the first step. Is it helps guide us when we have to make a decision. I think the other thing is it's how we treat every client in person, right? It helps guide us in treating them with dignity and respect, while also using the science of ABA to make sure that we're honoring the values of the client and the family, while also being culturally responsive. And I think, one thing that I had thought about really heavily is what is cultural sensitivity? Because, right now the big thing is like we talk about culture. Well, culture is many things. But cultural sensitivity and cultural responsiveness, being culturally sensitive is being aware. When I go to a client, I might be aware that, certain cultures, we don't look them in the eyes. I might be aware of that. But if I'm being culturally responsive, I'm actively adapting that into my programming. I'm actively making sure that I am adjusting and I am making the decisions based on my ethics for what are in the best interest of the client as well as the family, and then looking at their welfare, making sure that I am prioritizing the client's welfare within my decision tree.
So to summarize, ethics are rules. They're There are rules, there are guidelines. How much are they guidelines and how much are they rules? When are they guidelines? When are they rules? I mean, the QABA has its own ethical standards. Speak to that a little bit. What's the
So I think there are rules when it comes to the law, right? You don't break the law. So it becomes a rule that is a hard and fast no, but I think it becomes a guideline when you are looking at programming for the child, right? When I'm only using a guideline for what methods am I going to use, having honesty and integrity, following the way that we hierarchy it is, you have your ethics, but the law comes first. So if the law says you don't do this, it doesn't matter if your ethics gives it a gray area, yes or no, you follow what the law is, then you follow your ethics. And then I think you look into that cultural responsiveness when you are, and I think it's just kind of going down the decision tree within that.
Okay, so ethics are the rules of the board, basically, and it's a requirement for anybody who's qualified by the QABA to follow the ethical code. And it's not meant to be there as a system that's used to penalize people. It's a system that's used to guide people. However, if you do operate outside of those ethical codes, there is a consequence for doing that, and the consequence might be that you are, I mean, you could have your qualifications revoked, or you can certainly have some kind of disciplinary. But the point is that they're not laws, and that the legal system is separate from the ethical system. Although there's obviously going to be many instances in which they match up. That there are ethical standards that are also embodied into most laws as well, particularly around harming, things that might result in harming individuals. And then you said something interesting, that the law comes first. So if you are in an environment, and when we go internationally, this perhaps happens more than it does in the United States, but where there are sort of ethical codes, and then there are legal codes in whatever environment you're operating in, the law comes first, not the ethics.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's that's an important thing. It gets murky, doesn't it, when we go internationally, when we're taking these ethical codes into some contexts in which perhaps certain things are not as applicable in those contexts. What do we do? What's your advice for people in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, who may be encountering this problem? If there's something that obviously just doesn't fit the situation, what should we as practitioners do?
Yeah, I mean, that's when you use it as a guiding tool, right? As a decision, like a kind of decision you're going down. It's not always going to match every single situation that you're put in, and I don't think it's intended to. Otherwise, it would probably be the size of the Nakuba book, like this big. But I think it's important that you use it as a guiding tool. And when you look at your ethics, right, I think the question is always, when I'm implementing this intervention, am I prioritizing the dignity, the rights, and the well-being of the client and family receiving these services? If you ask yourself those questions along with your ethics, right, like I don't necessarily think that there's a way to go wrong about it. I think, to the point, like there is law, and then there's the ethics. There are certain gray areas like dual relationship, right? There's no law that says you can't engage in a dual relationship, but it's part of our ethical code that we don't. And it's that decision tree, right? If I engage in this dual relationship, am I, prioritizing the dignity, the rights, and the well-being of my client? And if you compromise any one of those, then that might be an easy decision. I shouldn't do this, right? I know in Western culture, right, one thing that I see often is a lot of times behavior technicians, they do amazing, right, with these families. They trust them. They become part of their family, really. And then the family is like, oh, but can you babysit for me, right? Like you do so well in therapy, but can you babysit? That would contest a dual relationship. So what they have to ask themselves is, am I compromising my ethics in doing this? Am I compromising the dignity, the rights, and the well-being of the child if I do this? So that would be kind of your gray area. It's not illegal, but it's unethical. Right? It's unethical to do that. And I think there are some areas of ethics. One of the really great things too, we have this in the States, and I think it'd be something that everybody could use, is there is a hotline. There's the Dr. Bailey hotline that you can call. And you can seek advice, like, hey, here's a situation that I have. And I actually think it'd be awesome for the international community to reach out, because it would help us to really identify, here are some common things that are happening, and maybe get better answers to this, right? How do we translate the idea of ethical issues in different countries? And so it might, kind of even promote them to do some additional research on it.
Just say that again. What's the name of the hotline?
I think, let me see if I can. It's Dr. Bailey. So it's the Dr. Bailey Ethical Hotline. And I believe I can find it. If I find it online, I'll send it over to you.
Yeah, maybe
But
you
you
can
can
put that
call
in the comments for the video below. That would
Yeah,
be great because I had no idea of the existence of. So there's a human being on the other side of that line who answers questions.
there is. Yeah, they do respond to it. You can leave a message and they'll get back to you. But it's really, I always find it very interesting. And I would love to even, know again, what are the common ethical questions that they
Mm.
get? And I mean, again, we even get things like, I know at one point in my career in the ethics, it was like, I went out for a drink with my boss and I got fired. And I was like, well, you probably should know that. It's not illegal. But again, did you compromise your own integrity as an employee, your dignity and your rights by doing that? So I think, if you just continue to ask those questions, and I think the other thing with ethics is approaching it from a curiosity. Everything we have to look at from a curiosity versus an accusing. I'm curious about this question, right? If somebody is asking an ethical question, it doesn't mean that they did it. They just need to be curious about what does that lead. We need to question everything.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I really like what you're saying there about these foundational first principles upon which the ethical codes and list those off again. There's the dignity, the well-being, and was that it?
So prioritizing the dignity, the rights, and the well-being.
The dignity, the rights, and the well-being. That ethics are there to protect the dignity, rights, and the well-being, and they've been developed to do those three things. And I guess circling back around to my question of then, what do we do in Vietnam, in Nigeria, in China? When we're faced with, well, we've got a code that was developed in one context by one group of people that may not be applicable right here, but dignity, rights, and well-being. Are we protecting the dignity, rights, and well-being of the individual and abiding by the laws of the country in solving the problem or addressing the situation that's sitting in front of us? And
when in doubt, ask, be curious, right? Email the quad board and ask them. Say, hey, I don't, I want to know how this plays out in my culture or this or that, or if this is acceptable, and I think if we all approach it from curiosity and we ask the questions together, we can really start to, I think, build upon this foundation. Because you're right, it is hard to translate, especially if it's not just it's like we have ethics in Western, we have ethics here. So I think we've got to be curious, and we have to make sure that together, as we extended Quaba across the world, we also have to come together and say, maybe that's somebody starts a group somewhere and they ask, maybe it's something. I know we're going to be presenting at ABAI in Portugal. Come sit down and talk to us and say, hey, here's some I would love to hear ethical dilemmas that people have run into across the world so that we can be better prepared on how we address it. I know it is something that even when we started to go international, that was a big question, right? We require background check. Not every country has background checks, right? Or how you administer, like even something like that was a unique approach. So I think there are so many of these situations that we really, if we don't know about them, we don't know how to create a plan of action to support them.
That would make a really great panel.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean that it's in an upcoming conference, getting members of the board sitting there and maybe collect some questions beforehand from the international community.
I think we are actually. I'm trying to think of what the topic was. Oh, we're presenting on your behavior analyst. Now what? Or what now? And honestly, I know Karen had put something out there asking for questions, so we could answer that. So I'll also make sure she sends it over to you. Anybody who, wants to ask them. And, I mean, we can even make time. I know we'll be there for a little bit, to even just sit down and talk to people. I love curiosity of people. It's probably why I got into psychology. I love to know who they are, the why, and really support them. I think that's one of my passions in this field is creating practitioners. At one point in my life, hopefully I will retire, and I want to leave the hands in very capable people. I want to leave the hands in people who want to continue to carry on the work that we've done and make it better. We're only getting started.
I think us people in the ABA stroke psychology field, we're very bad at retiring. There's one thing I've noticed is everyone just keeps working forever. We all talk about You know,
I know it's
uh,
it's hard. It's hard to walk away because you see it grow so much. And I was joking, like ABA is like, it's like a toddler. It's like a tantrum toddler right now. We're not anywhere past. We're just in a toddler stage. Everybody thinks it's so well developed. Like, no, I'm like, you guys, we have so much more growing to do.
yeah.
And it's just so awesome to watch it.
Yeah, and I think, I think the other point is that it's definitely one of those fields where unless this is really meaningful to you, you're not going to do it. I mean, it's certainly not the kind of work that you do just to make money, or I mean, you're not going to last at all.
Oh,
Especially,
no.
given the hardships you have to face as you're training in your first few years as a technician, and well, it's all difficult, but it's a very meaningful challenge, and I think that's why it's so hard to give it up, because it's like, well, this is the meaning of my life. Why would I stop doing it? I'm not looking at retirement. What's that?
Well, like, I don't know what I would do. Like, I'm pretty sure I've run at 140 miles per hour for most of my life. And my husband always tells me, he's like, another project? I'm like, well, yeah, I don't have enough. And he's like, there's hobbies. And I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure we're just going to take another one of these on.
I agree with that. I find it very difficult to sort of not be problem solving in this field, and thinking about things that I could do to improve the company, to improve a program, to improve a child's life, to whatever. It's just an ongoing passion and drive that I think we all share. So, look, Sheena, I think that we could carry on talking for a long time, I'm sure, but I think you have an evening to get along with. I certainly have a day ahead of me to be getting along with. So I think we can wrap things up. We can wrap things up there. From all of us, thank you. It's definitely been as the world of ABA has changed. Once upon a time, I was, like many in the international community, working through the BACB pathway. Then that was removed from us, and for the QABA to be doing what it's doing internationally, particularly, to see it grow and to know that we are a part of something in isolated little corners like we are here in Ho Chi Minh City, and there are many other people around the world I know who appreciate everything that you guys are doing, and please keep up the great work. It's an absolute pleasure to be a part of it.
No, thank you guys. I mean, you guys are the reason we do it. I'm grateful that there's so many practitioners out there that want to, continue to expand the field and change the lives of people across the world. That's the mission. And, I'm just so grateful that we have great people to carry it out.
Amen. Okay, so thank you very much, Sheena, and we'll cross paths again soon, I'm sure.